we talk with people and give interviews and more information about how you can use volunteers in the state. I'm Kelsey Priest with Volunteer Maine, and I'm a program officer here.
And I'm Mary Alice Crofton. I'm executive director, and we're pleased to co-host this piece of Volunteer 207. And I had a very interesting time speaking with Dr. Janelle Kerlin, who is an associate professor at Georgia State University, and she is in the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies, and she wrote an article about distinguishing volunteers from employees that I think you'll find very interesting. And my guest today is Dr. Janelle Kerlin, who is an associate professor in the Department of Public Management and Policy at Georgia State University. And welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And the first thing I'd like is to give you a chance to talk a little bit about how you got interested in or how this nonprofit and volunteering and work stuff fits into what you do on an everyday basis or your research area or whatever, and then we'll dive into the conversation.
Yes, I teach classes in nonprofit management, and so questions around volunteers, when to use them, where it's possible, what are the circumstances where they shouldn't be used, especially in the changing context of nonprofit work, where increasingly nonprofits bring in commercial activity, right? And so there's all sorts of questions around, well, what are the fair labor laws? What about minimum wage? What kinds of activities constitute, actual labor that has to be paid? So these are questions that my students have and that I come across in my own work because I look at commercial activities of nonprofit organizations.
Well, that's a great way for me to segue into my first question for you, which is in the discussion of how things get done, there's like this ongoing tension around the use of work and whether it should only mean paid effort or voluntary contribution of labor, volunteering. Can you talk about why the word has such a history and where things stand now?
Yes, well, I'm going to dive right into some of the legal aspects behind this because I think that's really what's pushing a lot of these questions right now. And so I'm going to refer to the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act, or otherwise known as the FLSA. And this act came out during the Depression by the Roosevelt administration. And there was a huge push, obviously, during the Depression to get people paid. And so the administration pushed for minimum wage and fair labor practices so that volunteers, not volunteers, but people who are actually doing work would get paid for it. And there was this overall discussion around improving the economy as well. If workers get paid, then they can pay for things in the economy, and it just keeps going, right? So there was this understanding that, work that was actual work in a commercial context needed to be paid for the good of the economy and therefore the good of the country to get the country going again during the Great Depression. So I can go on and talk a little bit more about kind of some of the rules around the FLSA that still apply today. A lot of these are still in play, and that's why we have this conversation around, okay, when should we pay somebody and when is it considered legitimately a volunteer activity? So
that sort of brings me to the article that you co-authored, and which looks at a legally informed definition of volunteering. What are one or two recent court cases that added to the understanding of when activity is employment and when is it volunteering?
Right. So the most recent court case, I think, that had the larger impact on this conversation is a case involving Ria Lana. And Rialana is a corporation, a national level corporation, in fact, that holds consignment sales. And these are largely pop-up consignment sales. They happen about twice a year. And they were using a nonprofit model where they would use volunteers to come and staff all the work that needed to go into hosting these consignment sales. And that was a really great operating model, obviously. A lot of money was able to go back to the corporation. And the volunteers, felt like they were lucky because they were able to get first access to the sales. And so they felt like it was a fair kind of trade-off, but the Department of Labor did not think so. Because a lot of their activities and how those activities were being done in terms of work schedules and oversight by supervisors and, when you can go off and take a break and when you can come back, all of this was really built around kind of a corporate employer-employee model. And the fact that they were being compensated, even though it was in kind, based on that first come or that first served basis, they were able to get into the early to these sales. That was still considered compensation by the Department of Labor. And so after a number of years, and I won't go into any details on these current cases, but after a number of years of going back and forth with the Department of Labor finally in 2000, let me get this, 2019, the courts finally ruled that the Department of Labor was in the right and that Rialana was going to have to pay its volunteers. Now, everyone might be thinking, well, that was a for-profit, obviously in the for-profit world, they're going to have to pay their workers and whatnot. But the thing is that all the criteria that were used in that court decision apply to nonprofits as well. And so increasingly what we're seeing in these court cases is that the organizational form just does not matter anymore. And what matters is the work environment. The actual activity is related to commercial revenue generation. And almost exclusively, this factor comes up, whether or not the employee or a volunteer is receiving compensation. Whether or not it's in kind or monetary. So that
part, a bit like here, where in Maine there is a test for employee that whether the person got something that was of value. So, like if you were a farm working on a farm and you got your housing or you got your food, that established the employer-employee relationship. And if I read your article correctly, that criteria is almost the most weighty one, because obviously volunteer organizations, we teach them to supervise there, to be sure people do get a clear scope of work and get feedback on their performance and all of that sort of thing. But that piece about like an economic exchange seems to be the critical one. Is that true?
Yes, it is true. I mean, while the courts take in the totality of the situation, what often is the deciding factor is whether or not compensation is involved.
Well, so if I'm a lay leader of a community program and we're operating like there are food warehouses all over the place, or there are also, emergency response to floods. We don't get statewide floods, and we certainly don't get your tornadoes. But we do get ice jams in the spring, and we get, those sorts of things. So there are people who are doing things like they set up shifts and they do schedule folks, and there are absolutely human resource aspects of the volunteer world that are essential for everybody's protection. But if I'm the leader at that community program, what are the most critical questions I have to ask myself so that I stay on the right side of the law?
Yes, so I have 4 questions here that I think are the most important. And I do have to say that I'm not a lawyer, right? But this is just gleaning from these court cases and the literature around this. The first one, of course, is whether or not the volunteer is engaged in a commercial activity, and any activity related to the generation of commercial income. So that, if that's no, then you don't have to go any further. You're fine. Your volunteers are fine. They don't have to be paid. As long as there's no commercial revenue generation, then we don't have to have further discussion. If there is some kind of
thrift stores,
right,
thrift stores,
right. If there's some connection with commercial revenue generation, then you move on to these next questions. And so that second one is what you were just referencing. How much control is exercised by the employer over the volunteer's work schedule? So, even in terms of, like laid out shifts, specific times set for breaks, just like you would see in the corporate setting. But that said, you mentioned that sometimes is necessary when you're trying to coordinate the work of volunteers. It's okay if that alone is present, right? What happens, because again, it's the totality of the situation. So even if you're like, well, I think we kind of have that, we kind of have a strict schedule, and I can tell them when they can take a break and when they can't, and we're really kind of rigid about it. I wouldn't get too worried just yet. If you move on and answer yes to the next two questions, then you might start getting worried. So let's move on to the next two. The third question is, to what extent are the volunteer services integral to the business activity? So for example, if your volunteer is doing so much heavy lifting in that commercial activity that when that volunteer leaves or is absent, you have to put in a paid worker, then that's kind of a red flag that, that we're kind of getting into some gray area here. That person is really integral to making this business work, whatever that commercial revenue is, generation is. And so then you might be getting onto a little thin ice. But the clincher, as we mentioned already, is the fourth question, and that is, does the volunteer expect compensation, whether monetary or in kind? In exchange for that, whatever work they're doing. So this is where there is some gray area though too, and it's a little frustrating because the courts are not clear, right? There hasn't been something that the Department of Labor has laid out in black and white about this, and it shifts slightly with different court cases, right? Just slightly, like what exactly is the circumstance then, right? And in talking with some nonprofits here in the Atlanta area, and I won't name them because I know this is going to be going public, but there's some concern around, well, we like to give our volunteers who are doing, a lot of work outdoors, some sandwiches, for a lunch break. Are we in violation of the FLSA when we do that? So they kind of keep it under the radar, and it's how they frame it, as a token of their gratitude and not as compensation, right? It all, because of the gray area around this, you have to be very careful. So not promising volunteers lunch in writing, right, might be a good practice, because it's also worded as the promise of compensation, right? Or volunteers expecting it, right? So you have to get the nuance, of the language, the nuance of the language. So, just being very careful how it's couched, and framing it more as a token of appreciation. This is we're very grateful that you came out. We'd like to give you a t-shirt, because we're grateful for what you did, and you can market our nonprofit that way too, kind of thing, but making very clear that it's not, kind of compensation for work that they did.
Because you showed up, you are not going to get. It's the barter system. I think in rural areas, certainly people are familiar with bartering. It's called the underground economy. So steering clear of that for certain. Well, this has been really helpful. So my last piece, other than, of course, I'm not an attorney either, and so neither we're talking about some stuff, is in addition to going to a local person who does have a background in law, where else could somebody read up or learn more about this?
There are, I would refer people to nonprofit attorneys first and foremost, because they know the ins and outs of the law, the fine print, the recent court cases. And it's kind of hard to keep up on that just on your own. Even some websites, may not have the most recent information. So I would refer people to their nonprofit attorneys in their communities first and foremost.
Right. Yeah. And I'd also suggest to folks that they reach out to the Maine Association of Nonprofits, which does a presentation that they do, not necessarily every year, but when the demand calls for it. Well, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Kerlin, for joining us. I want to say I was so pleased and interested when that flew across my desk I think it was in our Nova listserv that I saw, maybe the nonprofit management quarterly or something, but I was like, oh, I need to talk to this woman. And I appreciate your graciousness in joining us.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure to be here. Yes.
Yes, and we will be certain to point folks to their local library to find a copy of that article. There's a piece in it that I tried to get you to mention, and I will just throw this in here, about the change in the viewing of work as in the 60s as women sort of changed their involvement, and that's fascinating for people too. But we don't have time to talk about that today, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Kerlin, for that great interview. If you have any questions, you can contact us using the email on your screen. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Volunteer 207.